Welcome to the Superhero Cinephiles podcast. I'm your host, Perry Constantine. And today we got a special type of episode today. This is the first time we've got multiple guest hosts. First, we got Lance Garcia back, and he decided to bring a date, which is Steele Filipek. So how you guys doing today?
Good. The fact that you refer to Steele as my date is such an accurate so accurate. I think he and I talk to each other more than we talk to our significant others, and that's yeah. Let's not read into that.
A few words, and Adam's there when I need to speak them. So yeah, absolutely. He has called me his work wife before, even though we don't work together except on our side
everything
projects.
else.
Yeah, right.
So why don't we let the people tell the viewers a little bit about your listeners a little bit about yourselves. Adam, you've been on before, so how about you go first?
Sure. My day job is I'm a creative producer at Condé Nast. It is a very dumb job. I interview celebrities about movies and TV. I shit you not. My day job is I watch movies and then I write questions and then I talk to the celebrities about it, and then it does millions of views because not anything of that I do, but because it's because the talent is like, oh my God, it's Tom Hiddleston. So that's my day job. And my side projects are I'm a writer, I'm a novelist. I've published several Green Llama novels. I'm an audio drama producer. I'm also a comic book writer. There's a lot of things that I can't yet talk about, but I'm very excited. But the reason I'm here to talk is actually about an audio drama production two audio drama productions that Steele and I are working on for the better part of 6 years. God.
Okay, so before we get into that, Steele, why don't you introduce yourself, and then we'll talk a little bit about what you guys are doing together.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me on. I really appreciate it. My name's Steele Filipek. I'm a writer extraordinaire. I've written screenplays, pilots, comic books, video games. My role as executive editor at Starlight Runner Entertainment. I've helped to design story worlds for Microsoft for Halo, Sony for Spider-Man, Men in Black as well. I've worked on Pirates of the Caribbean, Tron, as well as smaller projects such as bands and socio-political campaigns. So I kind of run the gamut all around the media sphere. I also have two podcasts out right now. One that Adam kind of mentioned, one that's might be intriguing to those who are story world fans. It's called Building a Better Story World. If you ever wanted to learn how to build a mythology, build a story world that have lasting success, I give people tips and tricks and prompts and exercises and case studies to showcase how you too can build out story worlds large and small. And I've got a comic book coming out in August and called Arcane, an ongoing YA Lovecraft horror story about a kid dealing with a secret world that he suddenly opened up to.
Oh, very cool. Who's publishing that?
That's coming from Cosmic Lion Productions out in California. They're a boutique publisher. This is going to be their first ongoing series. Very cool group there. Eli is the publisher, the head of the production. He took me on because it's an ongoing thing. And they tend to kind of their idiom is looking at the indie comics of the 80s and early 90s. My book very heavily influenced by Saga of the Swamp Thing, and to a degree other such properties like Ninja Turtles and Cerebus and things that came out. So it kind of fit that idiom very, very well. And so that's we're gearing up for a publishing run and a digital run. We'll have 3 issues this year probably. There are already 12 in the can, so it's going to be an ongoing series.
Wow, very cool. I'm so jealous. I want to do more comic book work. I'm trying to get my art skills up to snuff so I can start doing it myself a lot more.
Now's the time, man. It's the revolution of vertical scrolling, such as Tapas and Webtoon, digital comics, crowdsourcing. It's a new golden age for comics. The kind of the traditional model is shifting. So some of the brick and mortar stores obviously are hurting, particularly with the pandemic. But creators are finding more control, more freedom, more fans. They're pretty much like everything with with this kind of direct service economy. You can kind of give people what they want directly and kind of cut out the middleman as much as possible.
Yeah, it's just a matter of getting my art skills up to the point where I feel like they're ready to start working on a comic.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, but Perry, I mean, don't understand. It's like you've done a lot of really great stuff as a writer and sort of helped build your brand in ways that I'm still jealous of. I've seen your numbers, and I've yet to hit that. So
Well,
don't
thank
undersell
you.
yourself.
I appreciate that. Yeah, the writing side I'm doing good at. It's just I got to get the art side up there. Just because, the getting the funds together for artists is the tough nut to crack.
Oh yeah.
Anyway, so tell us about what you guys are working on together before we jump into the movie today.
Sure. What we are working on is something called Radio Room, which is a audio drama podcast. We did one season about 2-3 years ago, and over the last couple of years, we've been gearing up to the second season, which will feature the second season of Steele's series Queens of the Sapphire Sea, and the first season of the licensed property The Green Llama, which is a comic and pulp series that I've been writing for almost 10 years, which makes me realize how old I am. But Steele, why don't you tell?
I was going to say, but it's based in the classic radio drama and the classic stories that came out 72 years ago. It's very, if you like the Shadow, if you like kind of Batman the Animated Series, that's kind of our take on it. Adam's really the lead on this. I'm helping to facilitate with that. But it's kind of like in the same way that Batman the Animated Series kind of, had this very specific time out of time approach. We're doing the same thing with this audio drama, not trying to recreate the original audio dramas, trying to bring a more modern sensibility to it while still, making sure that the piece stays true and, making sure the historicity is as close as possible. We're setting it after World War II.
Nice.
Yeah, so to that point, like it is one of those things where Steele and I had a lot of conversations about how we want to approach it. A lot of folks, when they try to recreate radio shows from the 1940s, like the Green Llama, they lean very heavily into recreating the sound and recreating the style of those pieces.
Right.
And both in terms of my own taste as a writer and my own taste as a listener, I went with what I sort of arguably call like the Indiana Jones approach, which was how do we create a radio drama that feels as if we're listening to it in the 1940s. Like, what if we're a kid, we're listening to an radio drama about the Green Llama, the Shadow, what have you? Like, what would that feel like, and how can we recreate that feeling today? So we did. It's a bit more of more cinematic than a radio show from the 1940s would feel. But it's obviously cinematic to the degree that one can be with an audio drama. But that also, and that same sort of approach is transferred over to the Queens of the Sapphire Sea. We try to create what is it like to listen and see these big blockbuster movies, but in audio form. And I could sit around and talk about the Green Llama for hours, but I really, and I'm not just saying this because I'm basically bound to him by the hip, but I love Queens of the Sapphire Sea as a series because it reminds me of like Tailspin. Growing up.
I was just thinking about Tailspin yesterday. Actually, that show was. I was thinking about it yesterday because it's on Disney Plus now, and I didn't realize it at the time, but I was just thinking about it yesterday. I'm like, Tailspin. That was my first introduction to pulp stuff.
Yeah, totally. It's very pulpy. Also, like it was Tales of the Golden Monkey, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
It's high flying adventure, but what's really great about it is it's light on its feet. It's very dialogue driven. I love writing those characters. Belle Bernassi, who's the lead, and her niece, Madeline, are just so much fun to write. There's a firecracker quality to them. And the cool thing about audio dramas in general, specifically with the Queens of the Sapphire Sea, is like we can go anywhere. We can do anything. The budget really is limited by our abilities as a writer and our skills as skills of our editor.
Right. What kind of sound effects you can create and all that.
Yeah,
exactly. I mean, obviously.
Yep.
Yeah, it's a huge thing. So it started off as a passion project several years ago now, and it's been one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. So I can again, I'm not just saying that because he's here, because I probably would say it to him even if he wasn't here. But yeah.
Yeah, but so if you're interested, if anybody who's listening is interested, you can find Queens right now at queens.buzzsprout.com. We're re-releasing the first season on a new channel, so if you want to get catched up, it's going to be going through the first 7 episodes before launching into season 2 in September. So that'll be 4 episodes of that. The best way to describe it for me is that if you love Porco Rosso, you love Miyazaki, you love those adventure serials, yeah, as it said, Tailspin and Golden Monkey and Indiana Jones, it very much has that kind of feel. And we're going to be doing that for 4 episodes, then The Green Llama for 8 episodes, and then going back to Queens to round out the season for another 4 episodes. So you can start there, and then The Green Llama will be launching in November.
Very cool.
Yeah, and yeah, I was going to say quickly, just say, like, if you are familiar with how Green Llama works, this is a sequel series to those novels, though it is written to be a fresh on board. There's references, some slight spoilers about what happens at the end of the novel that I'm currently writing, but those are vague enough that you can dive into this series with fresh eyes or ears, and sort of get a sense of this ongoing narrative that I've been doing for a third of my life, a fourth of my life at this point. So
I just want to note what you were saying about, finding a way to kind of modernize it, but still preserve that classic sensibility. Whereas, and that's been one of my, just to go on a bit of a tangent, that's been one of my criticisms of New Pulp and all that, is people try to make it like it was in the 1930s instead of saying, like, okay, well, here's what worked in the 1930s. How do we make it work to people today? Right. Yeah. Not just doing it the way they did it back then, because, it's not the 1930s anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know you and I have had discussions on that in the past, but that's like, there's a reason why there are some authors who are very good authors, New Pulp authors, but they've sort of stayed in a certain sort of section. And then you have other cats, like Rob Hart is a good example, who started a New Pulp at Airship 27 and is now like writing bestsellers because he tried to push that forward. So yeah, it's yeah, I forgot what the point I was going to make. So let's finish it.
Well, it's hard because you do want to maintain truth to what came before. Because if you lose that, then what are you really doing it for? You're wanting to harken back to it, but at the same time, if all you do is just recreate what has come from before, it becomes very staid, very much the same over and over again, and it loses its potency after a time. And there is a spectrum upon which this stuff exists, and there is, it's not like, it's just you succeed, you fail, or somewhere in between. There is kind of a range for that to exist. There are people who put out stuff that is really just a recreation of old stuff, and there are people who try to reinvent the wheel, and those that can all exist. But I think that there does have to be a kind of looking to the sensibility, looking to the essence of the property, looking to the essence of the genre, the tropes, and finding new ways to invigorate that, and finding ways to engage yourself as a creator. Because when it's 4 o'clock in the morning and you're still hammering away at your property because it's the only time you have before you go to your day job, you have to have some passion for it. Otherwise, you're just going to let it slip.
Yeah. Which is a really good segue, actually.
I was actually going to say the exact same thing. Yeah, I did not plan it this way, but it worked out very nicely. So that is kind of the perfect segue to the movie we're talking about today, and that is The Suicide Squad. James Gunn's newest first foray into the DCEU. And well, let's start off. First off, how familiar are you guys with the Suicide Squad comics? A little bit.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm gesturing like this, and like I said, I realize I'm on video, but this is a podcast. I know of them.
I'm a little more familiar than Adam. The characters they're in, and the team itself. And particularly Waller, was a character that came back over and over again. Harley Quinn, obviously, and some of the characters, particularly from the first film, I read rather solo and occasionally in anti-hero team books and whatnot. So I am familiar with it. It was never near the top of my list. I was very much a Spider-Man, X-Men, and Batman kind of reader until I got into indie comics, and then I kind of shifted. So that never quite met my taste, but I did read them more than say like I never really got into the Fantastic Four or the Avengers when I was a kid. I did read more the Suicide Squad and Suicide Squad adjacent properties as I was growing up.
I started reading the Ostrander stuff a few years back, and I read most of it. I haven't read all of it yet, but yeah, it really appealed to me in a large part. Like I always loved the concept of it, right? It's very like the Dirty Dozen is one of my favorite movies. So that whole concept of like using supervillains as this like black ops squad, I always thought that was a really cool concept, and also it works very well to explain how supervillains keep getting out of prison so easily, right? Because they participated in these missions and then they get out. Like that was kind of Ostrander's idea to begin with. It's like, well, how do we explain that supervillains are always going in and out of prison? It's like, well, they do these jobs for Amanda Waller, and then she puts years off their sentence, and then they get released early. So I thought that was a really clever way to kind of work that in. And then sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, like the basic idea is really inspired, and it's one of those things where you really sit back and like, why did it take so long for this idea to actually A, get made in the comics, and B, also get adapted into films.
Yeah.
I think it's really developed. It's really kind of exploded because there's this kind of cottage industry of similar stuff that's out and about. Doom Patrol, which is I wouldn't call it ancient, but predates a lot of the content from Suicide Squad. The Boys is another example of something more modern that has found success. Obviously, Deadpool is like the granddaddy of this space within the last decade. And there is this appeal to having these anti-heroes, particularly in a pop culture zeitgeist where it's superheroes all the time. And you also have a DC cinematic universe which has I wouldn't call them amoral, but certainly darker figures as heroes. And they're a little more controversial than some of the figures from the Marvel series. And so you have people who are just thirsting for anti-heroes or villains who completely shed that exterior, and say, well, I don't care what you think about me. I'm gonna do what I gotta do. And if I gotta if I gotta somehow kill this president or take down this undead horror, and I'll get 10 years knocked off my sentence, well then I'll do that because I've got a daughter, I've got a habit, I've got $50 million waiting for me in the desert that I got to get back to.
Yeah, you could listen to last time Adam was on the show when we talked about Snyder's Justice League to hear about how we thought about a lot of those characters.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting thing. Like, and that's one of the things I'm excited about talking about this film specifically is it is really interesting to see how the DCEU basically was a dumpster fire, and they never really abandoned it, and they've reshaped it over time to something that I find, if not always successful, a little bit more, I find it sort of more interesting. I'm more excited about some upcoming DCEU films because I'm like, I don't know what to freaking expect at this point, because the core of this world is just like so malformed, and they're clearly making it up as they go, and they're just like, let's see what works. So you have circumstances where, like, I don't necessarily love Birds of Prey, but I'm like, oh, that's a really this is a different film that I expected. I really enjoyed the Suicide Squad because it's like, oh, this is James Gunn's take on this, and like there's a lot of liberties that he was able to take that he probably wouldn't be able to take in a Marvel film, just because of the DC is just like, make it work.
Well, I think, but that kind of speaks to the difference. It is a double-edged sword when you get, everybody loves Marvel, and I say that obviously not everybody loves Marvel, but those movies come out, and even the failures, quote unquote, like Black Widow, still do okay. And there is this kind of temperate quality because Kevin Feige is at the head and he has this vision and he kind of brings people in line, not the least of which is James Gunn, who I like as a filmmaker, but you can see a lot more of, I'll call them eccentricities in the Suicide Squad versus something like Guardians of the Galaxy, where he has a guiding hand to kind of keep him on a course. So, and as Adam said, you get a little more of the quote unquote auteur, if you can call it that, in the Hollywood system. There's still a massive amount of Hollywood influence there, and if nothing else than because it's Warner Brothers. But you have Snyder making his own thing with his vision of that world. You have James Wan with Aquaman. You've got Wonder Woman. You've got Shazam. You've got these figures that are very, very disparate, and yet there is a kind of method to the madness there. They very much buying into the ethos of DC Comics, which has always been gods among men. These figures with immense powers, and and also dealing with the frailties and flaws of such a thing. Dealing with the ramifications of being Superman, almost literally being a god on Earth, having more money than anybody else, and more power, a la Batman, or as Wonder Woman, who is once again a personification of a god. So I do think that works out here, even in the Suicide Squad, which isn't quite like that, but you still get Gunn's flavor, and you still get that kind of spin from the DC universe.
Well, something else you mentioned that I wanted to quickly touch on is what Steele was talking about with the whole idea of these anti-heroes, these more R-rated type characters in like superhero settings. The interesting thing is that we've had them before, but we are seeing them done in a very different way now. Like, we had, for example, Swamp Thing or The Crow or Logan, even is like the most recent example. The Punisher, obviously, where the Netflix characters, Daredevil, Jessica Jones, Luke Cage, where you had these more adult oriented superhero properties, but they toned down the superhero aspects a lot. I mean, like even Watchmen to a large extent did that, right? It toned down the superhero elements a lot. But what you see since Deadpool and what The Boys has then done, and now the Suicide Squad does, is that they really embrace the superhero elements of that and put it in this very dark setting. So you've got the scene that was jumping out to me rewatching this movie last night was, Peacemaker. You got John Cena in this bright blue and red costume with this ridiculous helmet on his head, murdering the fuck out of people. And it's so divorced from what you expect. And it's just such an interesting way to see that in such a new type of setting.
I think it's, sorry, Adam.
No, you go ahead. Your voice is better than mine anyway.
I think it's leaning into the power fantasy that is being portrayed. I think that also, to get a little cerebral, and I apologize for it, if you look at the trajectory of superhero films, they start, obviously Batman and Superman in the 70s and 80s, but Blade, the X-Men, and Spider-Man really kick it off in the late 90s. Blade is a little more of an anti-hero, but the X-Men and Spider-Man very much show a belief in authority figures, a belief that these people can guide us and protect us, and that begins to shift the more we get into the aughts and then the 2010s, as people begin to show a disdain for authority, begin to try and they begin to question authority figures, be that the federal government, be that the police, be that whoever. And so it flips the script. You are suddenly giving the outlaws the power, giving them the chance. Well, the champions tried it and they couldn't make it work. So let's give it another shot. Let's give somebody else a shot and see what they can do with it. And there's a lot of fun to be had because, Superman's great if handled in the right hands, but he's always kind of a Boy Scout. And, and it's kind of fun to write somebody who's outside the law. It allows us to, live our id. There's a reason why Wolverine is such a popular character compared to various other members of the X-Men. And when they try to tame him in comic books or in shows, he kind of loses his edge. I'm not gonna say he becomes boring. I really like Logan and Wolverine as a character, but the edge needs to kind of be there to really sell that, and that's what these series are, embracing. Sometimes to a fault. The first Suicide Squad movie was not well received, although it made
No, really?
well, I'm trying to be politic here. I've worked with people who've worked on the film,
Yeah.
and but it made a lot of money because people were really interested in this vision. And that's going to be the interesting thing when we see this. Generally, this has received a better critical response from fans and from critics themselves, but is, as we're kind of aware, not performing at the box office in such a way as to be pleasing. And
Right.
there's going to have to be a deeper dive as to why that is, what the disparity is with that. I've got a few ideas. We can talk about that in a little bit, but I want to give Adam the chance to speak too.
Yeah, which is always a mistake. I think the thing is, like, one thing that you did bring up, Harry, was about how they sort of lean into the superhero, the comic bookness of it all, and that is something that I've been really just speaking directly to the DCEU, was that it did feel like they sort of initially tiptoed around the superhero-ness of it all. They sort of felt like, if we're Marvel's over here being like leaning 100%, 110% into the idea of the comic book superhero, like, how do we keep it grounded? Let's sort of lean into that Dark Knight aspect of it and bring it forward with Superman and build out from that sort of aesthetic. And it's been interesting to see how this series has evolved, that they've realized that the audiences are partially because of Marvel, but also because of like the way pop culture has evolved over the last 20-30 years, beginning with Blade, that people are open to the idea of like, oh, like someone can dress like a polka dot man and I can actually get some pathos from that character. Like, oh, I can have a talking tree that only says I am Groot, and people will respond to that character. So I think it's a combination of just like, to all the points that Steele raised about like anti-heroes and people being open to that idea, but it's also, there's this cultural shift of like, well, I can accept something ridiculous. Like I think there's a long time that a lot of film studios were scared of the superhero-ness of it all. I mean, look at the way that the X-Men were designed in 2000 compared to like what we're seeing in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, what we're even seeing in the DCU. It's that sort of cultural shift where people were worried that will the audience take these characters seriously? The only way we can do that is to sort of strip them of their, like, the goofiness of it, the Batmanness of it all, the 60s Adam West Batmanness of it all. And I think we're sort of like, because of a number of reasons, we've sort of found that middle ground.
So. And it seems like this is a lesson DC keeps having to relearn over and over again, because you look at, when you were saying that, I was thinking back to some of the other things, and you kind of see this trend repeating itself over and over again. Like, if you go back all the way to Smallville, started out very grounded, and as the series went on, they embraced the superhero aspects a lot more. Gotham, to a lesser extent as well. The CW shows did that first. Like, at first, and you look at that first season of Arrow, and it was very much, it's like so terrified of the fact that it's a superhero show.
Yeah.
And then after Avengers hits big, all of a sudden we've got Flash and Supergirl and the multiverse and all this stuff. And now you see kind of a similar in Titans as well. Like, the first season was like, started off very much this grounded type thing, and now they're running around in the costumes. And then now in the DCEU, it's a similar type of thing happening as well. So it seems like this is a lesson they just have to keep relearning over and over.
Yeah, I think budget has a lot to do with that. I mean, you look at that first X-Men film, very well received at the time. You look at it now; it has aged not quite as well as some of the other films from that. Ditto the first Spider-Man film. I loved both of those films when I was growing up. It's not a knock against them, but you look at the Green Goblin costume in that first Spider-Man, and you compare it to say Nunui, in this, and you can pull off so much more that would have seemed goofy, ridiculous, or been way, way, way too expensive. I mean, that was the knock against James Cameron's version of Spider-Man, why it never could really get off the ground, despite the pedigree that he brought with it, because they were budgeting $200-300 million. Now those kinds of movies with $200-300 million in 1990s dollars first, and and also that was just unheard of.
Mhm.
Now there is a little more of a stomach for that kind of thing, and you can do a lot with not as much. You know,
Mhm.
look to what the Mandalorian can pull off with those backgrounds, and with with very proper ideas of how to make something uh, bigger or seem more grand while keeping things under control. You know,
Yeah.
if there's a criticism that I'm going to bring to this new Suicide Squad film, you know, it is very high in budget,
Mhm.
and it's definitely a comedy. That's to me how it works. It works as a comedy. I'm not saying that it doesn't work as an action film, but this seems to be a comedy first, superhero
Mhm.
quote unquote
Mm.
second. And you know, comedies are very hard to translate across large, you know, swaths of audience across the international market, where so much of it relies on, you know, language or circumstances that don't necessarily translate well. And you can, you know, and that's not a knock against the film. It's just that it's going to be harder to pull that off. Witness the sequel to Blade Runner, which I loved, but
Me too.
was, you know, had a
Yep.
gigantic budget, and there was almost no chance it would ever make its money back. It was a sequel to a film from the '80s with no real bankable star. You know, Ryan Gosling is great. I love Harrison Ford, but they haven't, you know, Harrison Ford hasn't opened a movie really well since Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. Ryan Gosling is not that kind of leading actor.
Right.
Very expensive, very weird subject material, science fiction. It didn't quite make it work. And I think that's one of the reasons why Suicide Squad is kind of struggling a little bit right now,
And it
because the
well,
first one is not a comedy. It's an action movie, and this one is a comedy.
especially when you think about Blade Runner, like that was a, you know, it was the original one was a failure at the box office, and it was
Yeah.
only and it became a cult favorite in the years since. So it's kind of hard. It's kind of weird in that sense to do a big budget sequel to a cult movie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, and I think we're going to see the same thing with the Suicide Squad. You know, there are some pragmatic things, you know, why it's not necessarily, you know, hitting it in the theaters just due to the pandemic, due to like things like that. The fact that people are watching it on
Mhm.
HBO Max and whatnot. But I think it's going to, it will find its footing. It is the kind of film I watched it. And then I didn't watch it again in completion, but I went back to several moments that I really liked and watched those chunks.
Right.
And I think that that makes it worthwhile for a service like HBO Max, because it's
Right.
something that you want to have, and you don't watch everything, you know, from beginning to end,
Mhm.
but kind of like, you know, your favorite episode of The Office or your favorite episode of The Simpsons or Friends or whatever. You go back and watch 20 minutes of it, have a good
Right.
time, and then kind of go back about your day.
Right. One
Yeah.
of the things, going to the how it's doing and all that, I think the pandemic and also the simultaneous streaming release plays a big part in that,
Oh
because
yeah.
if because this is out in Japan in the theaters now as well, but if this had only come out in the theaters, I don't think I would have been able to see it yet. I think I would have had to wait, just because, you know, I've got a 7-month-old. We can't really get a sitter here, so and my wife would want to see it too. So being able to watch it on HBO Max has just made it so much easier. I may have tried to find a way to go see it in the theater, but now that it's here at home, I'm just going to stay home and watch it instead.
Yeah. And I think there's also like there is something to be said about the pandemic has shifted a thing that was already happening.
Mhm.
It accelerated the watch from home sort of aspect. Like,
Right.
and I say this is someone who goes to the theater basically once a week. Just because where I go is the Alamo Draft House. They're very good about social distancing, and like you have to wear a mask. You feel very safe there. So I go there like at least once a week, because
Mhm.
you know, I love movies,
Mhm.
but like there's been an ongoing trend of like, well, why do I need to go someplace? My TV is huge, my sound system is huge, it is great, I can do this from home
Mhm.
and not have to worry. So it accelerated something that was already happening. I think that we're seeing a shift in what kind of things are going to get made. I think that you'll still see the big tentpoles for theaters, but I think there'll be a little bit more not too diligent, a little bit more cautious about what they spend their money on.
Mhm.
And to Steele's point earlier, like, or make things like The Mandalorian with the volume, which completely changes the game. Like
Mhm.
the volume in and of itself is something that I am shocked works as well as it does. Because if you told me like, oh yeah, I do remember a friend of mine told me about it when it was in production, and like they're using mirrors or something. I don't know how they're doing it. It's, you know, like the way they describe, no one knew how to describe it, but it's this giant like LED screens. It completely allows them to shoot anywhere, anytime. You know, they can do a pickup for a completely different location. Like, oh, we need a close up of this guy. We never got it. Like, just bring him in, stand in front of the screen. There you go. It's absolutely insane. So I think there's a lot of things that I'm really curious to see how film production and the kind of films that we get shift once we move it post this pandemic, whenever that will be in 2020 35.
You know, we're talking a lot about the pragmatic, the production, but I want to hear what you two think about the story, you know, and in comparison to the first. I think, unless I'm mistaken, I think we all believe that this is a step up.
Yes.
And I would agree, but but I would like to hear, not just in comparison, but I trust both of your opinions, but also as a standalone film. Like, because I think it works as a film. I don't think it necessarily works as a standalone film. I think you kind of have to go in not necessarily knowing who the Suicide Squad is. It does do an okay job of that, but being versed in the superhero genre and kind of understanding the tropes and the subversions of those tropes. So much of the humor for me comes from the subversion of those tropes. They're about to break into the jail to rescue Harley Quinn, and she's right there. You think, Harley Quinn is going to, go off on this crazy adventure with this one figure, and, not to spoil too much, but and then she just shoots him dead. There are these things that kind of happen. And the whole opening, the first 10 minutes, is a big subversion of your expectations.
Right.
As soon as I saw Michael Rooker, I'm like, where is this going? And it completely went, somewhere different. And I thought that was fun. From a story structure, it does tend to slow things down a little bit. Once it got to the characters that we were going to focus on, I felt that, it worked better. It didn't have, for me, as much time to develop those characters. That's something I felt that Guardians of the Galaxy did do a better job of. We get to see Star-Lord first. We understand his pathos, what's going on with his mother, what happened. The fish out of water. You see him transform, and then we get to see each of these characters in their own space, and then come together. And you don't really need that for the Suicide Squad, because it is a true sequel. It's a soft reboot of the original, but we get several characters from that first one that come back in. And I don't think it quite pulls it off. I still enjoy the film very much. I just, Guardians of the Galaxy is just such a fun film. And I could rewatch that. One of my favorite fun films, of the last 20 years. And I'm not saying, it's the best film of those last 20 years, but I just really, really enjoy watching it and having a fun time. And I'll probably, I enjoy this one too. I just don't think it quite hits that mark.
Yeah,
I think the barometer I use is when my wife watches it, because she's, she likes superhero movies. She knows nothing about the comics though. And so if she can watch it and she can follow it, that's a pretty good way for me to judge like how well it's doing. It's doing its job, especially because English is not her first language. So if it can get across to her and she can understand it fairly well, like that's a pretty good indicator for me and that helps me avoid like my own blind spots on it. And with this one, I think we had watched the original one, but she had very little memory of it, right? Like even afterwards, she was like, did we watch the original? She's like, I feel like maybe we did, but I don't really remember. And so she didn't really have much attachment to the original. She didn't really remember any of the characters from the original other than Harley Quinn. Right. And that's more because we watched Birds of Prey. And so when we watched this, she was right along from the jump. Like she was able to follow it, perfectly, jump into the situation. She was able to pick up on what was happening. Everything flowed very easily for her. So I use that as kind of my barometer, is like, how well is this doing to reach the audience? And I think in that sense, it does kind of work as a standalone. It rewards you if you've watched the original, right? And like you were saying, with that idea of subverting expectations, you have 3 of the major cast members from the original right in that opening scene, right? You've got Rick Flag there, you've got Captain Boomerang, you've got Harley, and they're part of that initial wave that's just used the distraction, and then boom, Captain Boomerang gets his head cut off. And it's just like, and then, Rick and Harley obviously survive, but still it does still subvert that expectation of what you thought was going to happen. And then you're introduced to this completely different cast of new characters.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that you guys both brought up that I really enjoyed the film a lot. I think more so than my girlfriend, who wanted to go see it because it's a James Gunn film, because she really enjoys the Guardians of the Galaxy films. Like those are her favorite MCU films, bar none. Like
Yeah, same with my wife.
Volume 2 is her favorite of the entire MCU period. And I tend to agree with that. But so we went to go see it as a James Gunn film, and so she enjoyed it, but definitely not as much as I did. I think it did. The things I really liked about it is every character that survives, even the characters that don't survive, they all have arcs, and I think that's something that I have come to really appreciate. The more I don't want to say content, because I feel dirty every time I say it. Like the more films I've consumed, the more books I've read, the more work I've written, I really like that every character has a definable arc, or even if it's like not much of an arc, you're like, well, that's consistent with the character. Like I don't think Peacemaker has much of an arc, but it tracks with his character. So like I really appreciated that. I like that I was able to get a sense of each individual character throughout the entire story, and I was able to track those arcs and their stories throughout each. Whereas I didn't think the original Suicide Squad did a decent job of that. I think the original job, like you didn't, like, I forget who it was that they kill off in the first like couple of minutes, and you're like, oh, I don't even know who that was. I can't remember the character's name.
Yeah, I know who
you're talking
about.
Yeah.
Whereas like you got a good sense of like all the characters who died off in that first opening sequence. Like in that little bit of time, you understood who they were. I do feel like the film loses some steam in the second act, but it does sort of find itself again. But even then, even in that period of time where it's like takes a bit of a dip, you're like, well, I'm with these characters. I'm with these absurd moments that are subverting expectations, that are going against the or the grain of this genre. But to the other point that you guys brought up, it's like this: if you know about superheroes and the cliches that is addressing the expectations that it's subverting, and that's a larger thing where, Perry, your wife isn't a native English speaker, but you have shown her, I'm sure, a ton of superhero films.
Oh yeah. She's seen pretty much all of them by this point.
Exactly. So she's sort of already, like, she has that sort of bedrock of that sort of meta narrative. So, Melissa Marie, my girlfriend, she has that sort of a bedrock of that because she lives with me and she, grew up around comic books. She's a bit more critical of the movie in general. But it is an interesting point that Steele basically brought up. It's like, does the movie completely works on its own? I think it works on its own fairly well, but you do need to know a little bit about the Suicide Squad initially. You need to know a little bit about superheroes in general to understand sort of the tropes that it's addressing. And that's the point of going to, is like, there's so many things that are happening now, both within franchises and within narratives in general, that they're assuming the audience already knows, to the detriment of the stories they're telling. I think, I know Perry and I, you and I have sort of disagreed on the Marvel for a while now. Like you are a big fan of it. I'm much more cynical on it. And I think something that I've sort of, one of my biggest criticisms with Marvel is, and actually, that's not use Marvel. I'll use Star Wars, because that's something that I love and I'm being very critical of now. The latest season of The Bad Batch, for example, is a series that was, to my mind, aggressively mediocre, which is not necessarily a bad thing. I think there's a lot of spaces for aggressively mediocre stories. Like, it is, sometimes it's nice that a show is just fine. I'll put it on. My biggest criticism with the series, though, is that it leaned very heavily on the audience's pre-existing knowledge of the Star Wars universe. That, oh, hey, that character, they're back. Hey, that place, it's back. This, where it didn't do the job within the actual context of the story to make these characters, to make these places, to make these events matter to a new viewer. And I'm seeing that more and more, not just in Star Wars, I'm seeing it in Marvel. And to Steele's point, it is sort of baked into the Suicide Squad, where it's assuming that the audience has already read the books. It has already seen the movie beforehand. That it sometimes they'll not do the necessary work in the individual episode, in the individual movie, to make the story matter to the audience as if they've never come in and seen the film before. It's like, yeah, like I will. It's weird. Like I thought that like a good example of like it working, even though it shouldn't have worked. Justice League is a better example. The Snyder Cut works on its own as a film better than Batman versus Superman. If that makes sense.
Yeah,
because like it sets up everything in the first couple of minutes. You understand who these characters are, why they matter, and it does the work throughout the story. Even though I do not think it's a good story, even though I do not think it necessarily works, but it works better than Batman versus Superman to keep us in the DCEU. Because you dive into Batman versus Superman, like, who the fuck are these people? What do they want? Why do they want things? Like, it assumes that you know who Batman is. It assumes that you know who Superman is. But anyway, I'm gonna stop my tangent.
No, I agree with you. It's hard because the movie is between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah.
If it's just if it just completely ignores the other Suicide Squad movie, which does have its defenders, I'm not a huge fan of the film, but many people are. Made a lot of money at the box office, and it did drop off. But there are a lot of people who like that. In the same way that there are a lot of people who like Justice League, or the Snyder Cut, and a film that I'm mixed on. And so I think that if they just do another take on it, we saw what happened with that with the Amazing Spider-Man with Sony, where they just kickstarted it again and kind of did everything the same but different. And that was the big criticism. One of the reasons why my company was brought in to look at that in Amazing Spider-Man 2, like what were the criticisms? It was the repetitive nature of what was being shown. So they can't really do that. So they're kind of forced into a soft reboot. So I think that this film does as best as it could in that circumstance. I wish that this had been the first movie in the series and that it had played some things slightly differently, but that's not the real world. I think that this did the best that it could with its material. And I'm sorry, we've been monopolizing, Perry, but what are your thoughts on that?
No, I think you guys make good points. I don't know, maybe I'm probably biased because I come from the comic book background, where especially like when I came into comics, it was like the 90s where there was no hand holding at all. Right. You just get dropped right in and it's like, figure it out. And and I don't know, part of me likes that we don't have to be told for the umpteenth time that Uncle Ben died, or we don't have to be shown, Martha Wayne's pearls falling in slow motion for the umpteenth time, and that might just be selfish on my part, just because I know all that stuff already. So, and I fully acknowledge that, but I do kind of like that aspect that it's trusting the audience more to just kind of figure it out for themselves.
Yeah.
And there's a balance to that. Sorry.
I was just going to say that works with Spider-Verse. It opens up, the story, and it repeats that as a gag multiple times throughout, and it works. And you have other elements, other episodes and films and shows that make it work like that. I'm not a huge fan of Knives Out, but I think it does a great job of establishing there's this figure, this Kentucky Fried Colonel, who goes around solving crimes, and it just kind of like you just kind of thrown into the mix, and you're expected to kind of get along with what's going on. I like that. I don't think it's a problem with this film. I just I wish for a better world. Is what we all.
And I think to that point, it's like and we sort of touched upon this earlier, like it is finding that balance. Like there's a spectrum to these things. And you sort of talked about it with how you adapt like pulp stories and things like that. But it is, there's a spectrum, like how much do you trust the audience and how effectively do you convey the audience's existing knowledge into your story. I think, for example, Spider-Man Homecoming is one of my favorite MCU films because I think it does have that decent balance of you know the backstory with Spider-Man, and it knows the backstory of Spider-Man, but it doesn't have just of like the touches of, hey, this is what happened in this version of the story, that you're sort of like, okay, so yes, Uncle Ben died. That's kind of clear based on everything. What happened when, like, talking about the spider, like with Ned, you're like, okay, I got it. And again, I think the Suicide Squad does a decent job of overall, at least establishing who these characters are in this universe. To Steele's point, I think he's wishing for a better world. But I think the Suicide Squad is a good example of like, it does hug the balance fairly well.
Yeah.
So, this could have been very mean-spirited, and there's a lot of dark humor in this film. And, it is what it is, it's a rated R, superhero film, supervillain film. And it doesn't make any excuses for that. And that all works. But there is, there's not no pathos, some of other of Gunn's works. I'm thinking of Slither. It can get very, very dark, and there's nothing wrong with those films. But I think when you're trying to work within an established universe, that's a very dicey proposition to work with, because it gets, it can get depressing, and people don't necessarily want to watch those films over and over again. The example I always use is like Chinatown is an amazing movie, very, very dark. It works very, very well as a singular piece of art that is a statement to make about the world. It does not work as a story universe. There's a reason why The Two Jakes, which is a perfectly serviceable film, just doesn't feel right, why it didn't succeed, why there wasn't that third movie that was promised, because that's not the style of it. This does a good job of bringing levity to balance that darkness out to it and make it a fun watch, and, continue this on, continuing on the legacy of the first film, the DC universe in general, and some of these figures that they're hoping, obviously are going to explode in a way that they can exploit in a certain fashion.
I think that I going back to another point, like it does. I left the Suicide Squad like probably more excited about the DCU than I was at the beginning of the year. And I'm someone who actually likes Wonder Woman 84. So that's another conversation for another time. I know.
That was Derek and I did an episode on that before he passed. You can go back and listen to that.
But it feels like the DCEU is becoming more cohesive in its diversity, if that makes sense. I feel like, even though I went into this movie and it came out as like, this feels like a James Gunn movie. This feels like a really, not a pure, but a very James Gunn film, but it still felt like a James Gunn film in the DCEU. I love Shazam, and while that it's not a perfect film, a lot of my love of that is tied to things that are completely disconnected with the movie itself. It still feels like a DCEU film. It feels connected to that in its own way, but it still feels it's weird. Like I kind of feel like the DCEU has become, for better or for worse, like they're like, hey, this artist and this comic, you just go nuts in it. Like, do whatever you want. Just make sure like there's enough touches to sort of connect it to the wider universe. But like, I like that I'm seeing this more distinct artistic style within this larger universe. I think, in context, it's made the Snyder stuff a little bit more palatable. Or palatable. I can never remember which one it is. But basically, like, because it's like you have like these broad strokes and they all sort of like do tie into a larger piece, even though I think like the Snyder films are garbage. I still think that like it's like I can see Henry Cavill's Superman existing in the Suicide Squad universe, and I can see the Suicide Squad existing in the Shazam universe, and Wonder Woman. I can see them all sort of like interlocking without necessarily losing that specific flavor that I got in the Suicide Squad, that I got in the Wonder Woman films or Shazam or Aquaman or whatever.
One thing too, I thought that this film did really well, and this goes back to something Steele had mentioned, was about the fact that this is a supervillain movie. Whereas I felt the first one, there was too much of an attempt, I think, to try and rationalize their actions. There too much of an attempt to make them be like to moralize them in some ways. Like there's a lot of focus on the fact that, Deadshot's doing this for his daughter and all that. Whereas in this movie, they're unapologetically supervillains. Yeah, they're saving this country from a giant star monster, but they're still doing it because it's more out of their own self-interest than anything else.
Yeah, but note how that works.
Yeah.
Because we find out, I'm not going to spoil too much if anyone hasn't listened, but the big bad that they're going for, that they have to deal with, there's a twist that comes along with that speaks to authority and lack of authority, lack of respect for authority,
Right.
and
Yeah.
that allows for a twist on it that kind of works. So one of the things that Sony was trying to get off the ground for a while was a Sinister Six film. They could never quite pull it off, and there are reasons for that we can get into offline. But one of the things that they recognized, if it was going to work, that the Sinister Six, very much like the Suicide Squad, they would have to embody these villainous qualities, and they'd have to go up against a force that is even worse than they are. And so I think that's where you get that's where you can kind of get a little bit behind these supervillains in this, because they are villains, but they're selfish and they're crazy, but they seem like broken China dolls in a way. There's a little bit of pity for them, whereas there isn't really pity for the other villains, the other figures in this,
Right.
and that allows these supervillains to allows us to live vicariously through these supervillains, in a way that might not have been possible earlier, or in a different universe, or in a different format.
And just touch on something, and then I'll toss it over to Adam. Sorry, I want to get this thought out before I forget it. But one thing you mentioned there is about that twist too. One of the things I thought that twisted really well is it made up for a problem with the first Suicide Squad movie, where the first Suicide Squad movie, the threat doesn't exist unless Waller forms the Suicide Squad, right? That's the only reason the threat exists in the first place, is because she formed this team. Whereas this time, you've got a similar situation where it is this problem that has kind of been created by her, but it's more about cleaning up her messes as opposed to it being directly tied to the creation of the Suicide Squad. And I thought that was a much better way to do it. Sorry, Adam, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say that, like, I'm still shocked that because it's in the trailer, so that Starro is a thing that I saw on a movie screen. Like, I'm shocked that, like, especially the way that it's portrayed, and that's just, like, and that's one of the things I thought was really well done. Even Starro had an arc, which I didn't really expect, and I don't want to get too much into the spoilers, because again, it's in the trailer, so it's not like I'm spoiling that, but there's aspects to his character, or their character, or its character, that it's really, really interesting, that, like, it goes to, like, absurd. You're like, there's certain visuals that are just ridiculous looking. Like, I like the way it's hilarious, and then it's horrifying, and then it's like nightmarish, and then it's like just heartbreaking. There's one line towards the end that Starro says, it's like, ooh, that's just put everything into different contexts. And I think that's, like, one thing I really liked about the movie overall, is that you go through a lot of emotions per scene. When Steele and I were talking about a script that I had written, and not just what worked about that, and what I think worked about this film, is that every scene, you can sort of track each character's purpose, where they're going, why they're doing what they're going through. Not always, but for the most part. Like, and again, I'm sort of repeating myself, like, every character has an arc. Even Starro has an arc. Everything, you're able to sort of have all these different flavors in this one story. And I think that's, like, I'm speaking around a lot of ideas because I'm trying to get them all up my head. But basically, I think what I loved about the film in general is that it showed all the different flavors one can have in a superhero film. It was never just one thing. Yes, it's a comedy, but it had a lot of pathos and moments of real humanity in there. It had something to say, but also it was irreverent. It took itself very seriously and never took itself seriously at all. Does it always work? Not always, but I really liked that I was able to see that in a multi-million dollar studio backed superhero film. I think that a lot of my criticisms with a lot of Marvel films, like, you kind of know what's going to happen in them for the most part. Like, that the good guys are going to win. That, like, you can sort of, like, and Black Widow is a good example of like, you kind of knew like, all right, it's an hour and 40 minutes. Here comes the big action scene. And sure enough, it happens. Is it well put together? Yes, it's very visually stunning. But what I liked about the Suicide Squad is that, even though it's like an hour and 45 minutes, here comes the big action sequence. I've lost half the characters. They've all died, or the way we got there was interesting. And the emotions and the stakes have all been sort of built to that moment in a way that I don't think a lot of large productions like this are able to do. Like even like just Jungle Cruise, which was fine. It's a lot of fun. But like at the same time, it's like when that big action sequence happens, it didn't have the sort of emotionality that Suicide Squad had.
Well, I mean, speaking of Jungle Cruise, like, I did not feel that the Suicide Squad had as much theme and depth as you thought, Adam. Although I did think it was much better than the first one. I felt that there was there. But compare Jungle Cruise to Jumanji, the two Jumanji films, which I wouldn't say was blown away, but I had zero expectations going into those films, and I think that's why I liked them. And I think also for this, I try not to watch trailers unless everybody's talking about them, particularly for comedies, because it just ruins so many of the gags, and that's so much of the fun of a comedy is the unexpected quality to it. And if you kind of show those moments, it does kind of, I wouldn't say it ruins it, but I want to be surprised. So I was not expecting Sorrow to show up, and that figure features into two DC things that I loved growing up: Justice League, the Paul Dini version, and Batman Beyond, the two big figures in those works. And so I was like, oh, this is cool. I get to see it. And I could have it. The movie definitely shifts once the focus is put on that. And I'm not going to say that it's worse for it, because I loved seeing it. I love that figure. But that could have been its own movie. There's a lot that's going on in this picture. And I think, it's not like the first Suicide Squad where it's like, let's throw everything into this and see what works. And none of it works together. That's cruel. There are some sequences to it that I think work. And I think that Will Smith's performance is as good as it could be in that particular thing. But it's very stilted because they did so many reshoots and they cobbled it together out of this cut. And it just, it doesn't get moving until like 50 minutes into the film. Whereas this one, like, it just moves. And, it's almost the opposite problem, where there's so much stuff and there's so much going on, and it's all kind of tightly wound. And I could have used a moment or two to slow down or to refocus a little bit, because we have some characters that are killed off fairly quickly, and that's the gag. That's why it works, because it's a comedy. And I think had they done this seriously, I think it would have been just as much a failure as the first one in terms of critical response. It works because it allows the comedy, the very dark comedy, to come out. I just think that some of that thematic stuff, some of that depth gets lost along the way, because there's so much there.
It's fair. It's fair.
One of the things Adam was talking about with Starro, and how it, because same thing with me. I'd never expected to see Starro that way in a movie. I thought at best you would have like what they did in the animated series, and what they did in Morrison's JLA run, where it was just like these like spores that attach to the face like they have here. But I never thought you'd see like the giant 1960s Starro, right? That just seemed too ridiculous. But this is something that James Gunn has done before, right? He did it with the Celestials in the first Guardians of the Galaxy, when everybody said that's impossible and I look ridiculous, and then he throws them in. Even just the very existence of Rocket and Groot too. That's again something that people would say was too ridiculous. And James Gunn's like, nope, we've got a raccoon, he's got a machine gun, and his best friend's a giant tree, and that's just the way it is. So I mean, I think that's one of the things I really admire about Gunn, is just that his confidence in him being able to sell these concepts that are so ridiculous when you look at them on paper. And I think that was something that he did really well in both the Guardians of the Galaxy movies and in this one as well. I think that's a lot of his trauma sensibilities coming to the fore, because that's kind of like the ethos of that studio, right? It's just like, it's ridiculous, but we're going to do it anyway.
You have to own it, and that's if you own it 95% of the way there, you don't get it. It doesn't work. It has to be involved with it.
And I think that is the critical failure of a lot of like the films that sort of like always kind of fall short. I'm trying to think of a good example, but I think, yeah, it's like Gunn is 100% behind this crazy idea whenever he does it. I think a good example is Black Widow, because that's the one is fresh in my mind. Like, if what didn't work for me in that movie was that it was 95% or like 90% behind this idea of like, what if the Americans had to deal with like the fallout of their crimes, but it's Black Widow. Like it felt like there was like they were like inching towards that, and they're like, well, no, we can't go that far. We have to pull it back a bit. You know, and the same thing like within Batman versus Superman. It's just like, what if we have like this really dark version of Superman and Batman fight, but they don't really go the full way in some ways, because they're just like, well, he's still Superman, he's still Batman.
Well,
yeah.
And something we talked about before is that the fact that what you thought, especially that Batman v Superman was supposed to be, would be Batman going after Superman for causing all this death and destruction, and then Batman's just as bad.
Yeah.
Which would have formed an interesting moral quandary, even though if it seems like it's kind of twisted, but it still would have made more thematic sense that way. But I'll use another example too, and that's the later X-Men movies, because you look at the original trilogy. It was when studios were gun shy about superheroes. I understand that, so they got to make them more grounded. So they put them all in black leather and all that. But then you get to Days of Future Past, which feels like it should have been made in a pre-Avengers world. As much as I like that movie, it does feel like it's kind of anachronistic. And then you get to Apocalypse, where at the end, which was not that good, but then you get to the end of Apocalypse, and it seems like they've embraced the superhero aspect. And then you get to Dark Phoenix, and they're back to all black jumpsuits.
Yeah.
And it's like, again, there's this continual fear of going too far into the superhero aspect of it.
Yeah. Another good example is, and Steele and I've talked about this, but like it is sort of like with Star Wars, it's, they go with The Last Jedi, which is a film I unequivocally loved, and they're just like, let's just go full throttle and do this thing. And then they release The Rise of Skywalker, and J.J. Abrams is like, but what if we don't? And I think there's a lot of other stuff on that I can talk about offline, but I think that's another good example of like just not fully committing to an idea. Whereas Gunn is very good at fully committing to like whatever absurd idea that he's doing.
Yeah, I would echo that statement. I'm much more critical of The Last Jedi than Adam is. I don't hate it. It's not my cup of tea. But once you own that, you kind of have to own it. And that's where we're kind of bringing this back to the DCCU. There is this vision that Zack Snyder got to establish for this era of DC content. And the best content has leaned into that, and to some degree or another. Obviously, Wonder Woman, Shazam, and Aquaman do it not as dark as those other visions that Snyder's putting out, or for that matter, Suicide Squad or the Suicide Squad. But there is that kind of that darkness. These people have this amazing power that they are reliant upon. There's a huge amount of responsibility for them to act fairly. And there are dark undertones to that, where you don't get that level of darkness in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The most you get is you potentially something like Ant-Man, which is about which is a heist movie. It's about as anti-hero as you can get. To a degree, Black Panther, which is about the responsibility of nations and kings and rulers, Civil War, but it's not ever dark like some of these DC films are. And I think that's why this film works, why the other films work, even though I'm not a fan necessarily of the Man of Steel, of Batman versus Superman, of Justice League. There are aspects to them that I like, but I'll also be frank. I'm not a huge fan of the Avengers movies, so I just they're not. Once again, they're not my cup of tea. I much prefer this. The smaller stories of, if you can call a gigantic Hollywood film a smaller story, of Homecoming, Far From Home, of Ant-Man, of some of these, even the early works when you kept Captain America and Thor, and to a degree that first Iron Man film, which is still a pretty big film. I don't know. It just this kind of, I like this. This works. It's fun. I know I've been critical of this film at a couple times and pointed out, but I don't want it to come across like I didn't like the film. This is a solid B plus for me. Very, very enjoyable. A great watch. I'll probably rewatch it once or twice. I've seen Black Widow once. I'll probably never see it again. I don't need to. It didn't disappoint me. It was just like, okay, that was fun. In the same way that I'm probably never going to watch Thor 2 again, whereas I rewatch Thor Ragnarok, once a year, just because it's so fun. And that's kind of what I was hoping for from this, and that's what I got, which I did not necessarily get from the first Suicide Squad film. It wasn't fun for me.
Oh yeah.
Any specifics in terms of characters or performances that kind of stood out to you guys?
Oh man, I just really love the central cast. Like I think they did a great job with Idris Elba's character. It was Deadshot, right? No, that was the first one.
That was Bloodsport.
Bloodsport. Yeah.
Bloodsport. Yeah.
He was originally supposed to be Deadshot, but then they decided to make him Bloodsport instead in case Will Smith ever wants to come back.
Which I think is both the right production idea and the right narrative reason.
Yeah,
I think you pretty much needed a hard, it's a soft reboot, but it's a hard soft reboot if that makes sense.
Yeah, I just like even Ratcatcher. I love the connection he had with Ratcatcher. I really liked Polka Dot Man. I thought that was really surprisingly funny and oftentimes kind of hard to watch story. I think that's the biggest thing. Like I was really surprised by how well Gunn does an ensemble piece. And I think that is something that, like, if there's anyone who is the right person to do a film like The Suicide Squad, it was James Gunn, because look what we do with Guardians of the Galaxy. But yeah, I think, I connected with every single character, even if I didn't love them. Like Peacemaker, I was always excited when he was on screen because he's funny and it's weird. And even like, so it's more of a story point. Like I just think that like the ensemble was so strong that you're like, honestly, like I think even though Harley kind of felt like sort of tangential to the story, she had a really interesting storyline. I just really liked I love the new cast. I thought it was a surprisingly touching story. I
could watch Idris Elba read a newspaper. He was the one thing that I really unequivocally liked about the Dark Tower film. I like him in it. The rest of the film is okay. To be merciful, and I think that and everybody else, like John Cena was great. This was a role that was perfect for him. The various other figures, the villains were all good, with the exception of the Generalissimo, kind of a stock character. I would have liked a little bit of a different thing, bordering on stereotypical. And I wouldn't disagree if one would argue that. The one thing, I love Margot Robbie. I, Tonya was one of my top films in the year when it came out. She was amazing in that role. She's done a lot of really, really good cinema. Her take on Harley, it's not bad. It's beginning to wear a little thin for me. I still enjoyed her in this. There are lots of really interesting twists and plots with her, but I've never been as in love with Harley Quinn as so many other people are. And just the kind of like the psycho rocker girl take that she has is fun, but it's kind of like when you watch it, an episode or a television that you love for like the third or fourth time, you're like, haha, it's funny. But imagine if you had to watch it again and again and again, it would lose some of its charm. It still works here. But if you told me, oh, there's going to be another Harley Quinn movie out 2 years from now, I'm like, I'm not sure I need another one of those. Unless it takes another twist, unless it develops. She does have an arc, and there is some good stuff with her, and Margot Robbie does a good job again. But after seeing her in Suicide Squad and Birds of Prey and this, I'm not getting the evolution that I'm necessarily getting with some other figures in various cinematic universes. Once again, not a criticism, does great, but I think that this is probably my last ride where I will just take it as it comes. I think there needs to be something more there.
Well, count me. I thought I was the only one, so I'm actually kind of glad you said that. But I never understood the fascination everybody had with Harley Quinn. Like, even when she was in Batman the Animated Series and all that, I'm just like, okay, she's the Joker's henchwoman. That's cool. But I never understood like why she was such this, this character that fans were just crazy about. I mean, and to your part, like as fun as it is, the Harley Quinn animated series, it does kind of have that same kind of thing where after a while it does get a little bit old and it's fun. It's still fun to watch, but if you binge it all at once, like I did, because when I got HBO Max, both seasons were on there, it did get old by the time I got to the end of that second season. And I think one of the things that I think all these movies prove, not only this one, but also the first Suicide Squad and Birds of Prey, is that Harley works best in, I think, this kind of setting when she's got these other characters to play off. When you make her the central character, and I enjoyed Birds of Prey for what it was, but I think one of the biggest problems of that is that you're trying to make Harley the central character, and I just don't think she's got enough growth, and she's just not interesting enough to really kind of carry the movie on her own. But when you have her in something like this, where she's playing off Bloodsport, where she's playing off King Shark, where she's playing off all these other characters, she's much more interesting, and she's much better as that foil character.
Yeah. And I see that, because I do think that like she's definitely having an arc of sort of overcoming this toxic relationship, which I think for me has been like, even though I'm not like you, I don't love Harley Quinn. I do like what Margot Robbie does with the role overall. And I enjoy the Harley Quinn TV show. I've liked the character, but I've never loved the character like a lot of other fans do. But I think the aspect that I've always enjoyed about her has been the sort of seeing that evolution of, in a toxic relationship, the mad love storyline, and then moving beyond that and freeing herself. And I like that we're seeing aspects of that in Suicide Squad, Birds of Prey, the Suicide Squad. We're seeing that arc, but it kind of has to go further, to Steele's point, in that next thing. Like, is it hooking up with Poison Ivy? Is it another Suicide Squad film? Because I think she does work better in context to others. I think having her, I don't necessarily know, unless it's like basically her versus the Joker. I don't know what her next story is.
I would see the right Poison Ivy Harley Quinn film. I know I just said that this is kind of where I'm at, but that would be interesting. I liked those episodes of Batman the Animated Series, and there've been several successful comic runs that that depict that duo. It's hard for a character like that because she, much like the Joker, she is chaotic. She is the figure, that the wild card that kind of destabilizes thing, which works in a group but can become so random if kind of focused upon. And so if you have that as an antagonistic figure, it works very well, because Batman is all about, it's almost fascistic order. You have these very wealthy, very controlling corporate interests that control the excesses of the rabble, and then you have the chaotic Joker figure and his and to that and Harley Quinn, destabilizing that. It's the part of the Dark Knight that works the best for me. Those two forces battling back and forth, and Harley works very well in that. But once you break her out of that, once that toxic relationship is broken, once you're giving that character an arc that moves beyond that, there does have to be the next step. But it's hard, because what people like about her is that she is that chaotic, broken individual. And so once you fix that, that's the end. It's it very much why you can't really have Logan kind of figure everything out about his past, because once you do, his arc's over. And where's the rage? Where is the chaos? Where's the animal? Where's the beast anymore? And now he's just solved it. So, and it's the same thing with Harley Quinn. She needs to be the beast. She needs to be that chaotic figure. But the only way for her to have that arc is for her to have some kind of fulfillment to that. I'm sure a capable writer, a capable team could do that. But I think it's going to be a little have the cake and eat it too. You know, they want her to be this character who does hopscotch, coming in and being weird and making crazy love to this figure she just met, and you know, and then all the craziness that happens thereafter, and at the same time, you know, trying to, you know, be regular, but that's not who she is.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I mean, one of the things too, I also, sorry, go ahead, Adam.
No, I was going to say that it still does touch upon something that he and I've talked about a bit, where like with every franchise, there has to be what is it, the Misty Mountains,
The Distant Mountains, yes.
Distant Mountains, yeah. There always has to be some aspect that is never completely discovered, whether that be like Harley, like whether it be Harley Quinn's like losing her chaos, because that's sort of what her arc is. She is eventually going to become something more or less, not normal, but like less chaotic. But you should never really see that, in the same way that you should never really see Logan learn everything about his past, the same way that you should never really learn about you know, the origins of the Sith, or you know, you shouldn't have every answer, because that is part of the appeal, not knowing and not seeing. And like, she's always going to be going towards that direction, but she should never really get there. And that sort of, you know, then comes a point where you're like, when is the time do you say stop? When do you end with this character? When do you like say like, all right, we're gonna just let her kind of go off on her journey, right off onto the sunset, and just know that there are other adventures that we may or may not ever see.
Yeah. Also, I wanted to mention too, I loved King Shark in this movie. Like, I thought Stallone did an amazing job. And also, like, you know, I love that James Gunn is able to bring in these big actors to just do these like voice roles. Like he gets Vin Diesel to come in and record 3 lines over and over again. And he gets, you know, Bradley Cooper to do Rocket in a voice that's not at all like Bradley Cooper's voice. And then he gets Stallone to come in and I don't know, something about that voice and just like the mannerisms. Like I loved everything about King Shark in this movie. Like, every time he was on screen, I could not look away.
Yeah, you know, so much better than Killer Croc. I love Killer Croc. I love the darkness of that figure. You know, the great episodes of Batman the Animated Series with him. Great issues of the comic with him. You know, very interesting take in Arkham Asylum. Really liked you know, the level with him in that world.
Oh yeah.
And also just his presence in that world is great. Like this, you know, kind of unseen horror that, you know, breaks out. And there wasn't a lot there. You don't need a lot for a character like that. And I think that I think that Naniwe, you know, really does kind of bring this to, you know, to something else. You know, there is a character here that is just enough, just enough to be fun without being, you know, without having to have every character have such a depth of, you know, experience. You do kind of need these, you know, side figures here and there to kind of, you know, lighten up the mood.
Well, also, I think he's a perfect example of just embracing the absurd of this world, because even like he even does, like he's like, oh, I'm gonna wear a fake mustache, and it's just like, it's just like, that is the perfect kind of absurdity that you see from this. And I almost kind of wanted to see him slap on a fake mustache and try to go into town.
Polka Dot Man too, really liked that.
Yeah.
You know, talk about taking an obscure character that really doesn't have a lot and doing a little bit of something. And it just shows you don't need to do a ton. You know, when I won't ruin the gag for those who haven't seen it, but when we see through his eyes for that first time, just a great moment that's funny, but it's funny because it has that, it's not touching, but it has that ring of truth to it that makes his character kind of, you know, work.
It's also it's funny, but it's also terrifying at the same time too.
Oh yeah. And then later on when we see it again, you know, when he's in the club, you know, absolutely.
And I think that's something else that I really appreciated about just the movie in general. Because after we left, Melissa Marie asked me like, so is that his origin from the book comics? And I'm like, you know, I don't really know. We looked on Wikipedia and it wasn't.
No,
I really appreciated like the liberty they had, and this is sort of kind of true about both Marvel and DC, that they understand that it's, you know, you don't need to be 100% to the comics to make a good comic book story. You can like, and I really like with Polka Dot Man and there's a couple like Ratcatcher 2, like they're all just really original takes on these characters that, you know, tying it back to the beginning of our story, like it sort of straddles that line of like understanding and touching on what came before and what makes us love these characters while never really losing it, like while still pushing it in a new direction.
Yeah, it's hard to do that with more established figures unless you
True.
have something like a Batman where there's this expectation that very much like James Bond, there's going the next actor, the next iteration, there's going to be something different with it. It's the next look at it. So you can have the Burton Batmans, you can have the 66 Batman, you can have the Nolan Batmans, you can have, the Affleck Batman, we're going to have the Pattinson Batman, we're going to have all these different figures, the animated series, all that jazz.
Brave and the Bold Batman.
Yeah, but right, exactly. And and when you have an obscure character, there's a little more license to kind of do something a little different. Speaking of Batman, with Mr. Freeze, a very central figure to the Batman mythos now, but when he was brought back in that Paul Dini written episode, which I believe won an Emmy, or at least nominated for it. Yeah. It brought a pathos and an origin that was interesting, that was outside the bounds of that character from before, and it made it work. And the Polka Dot Man for me was it wasn't the reason I liked this movie, but it didn't hurt. That there was something there that was a lot of fun. If it had just been Suicide Squad again, without those figures, if it was Harley Quinn and a couple of others, whatever. I get it, it's a hard line to balance. You do need to give the fans what they want, and I think you get a little more license with a character like Polka Dot Man, where if you mess him up, no one really cares.
Right?
Yeah, that's fair. That is fair. Yeah.
Also, I want to give I want to also mention Joel Kinnaman, because his performance as Rick Flag in the first movie was nothing special. That character was pretty much just a waste of screen time. But I really enjoyed him in this movie. I thought, and I love that Gunn actually gave him something to work with, actually gave him, this ethical conflict to work through, beyond what little we get in the first movie. And I thought I was really impressed with him in this movie. I don't know how about you guys felt about him.
I honestly, until I started watching this, I had completely forgotten about his character. Not like,
which is insane, because he was like a central character to the first film. Right. Like his whole thing was like he had to go save his girlfriend.
Right.
Who was never mentioned again.
I just honestly, yeah. And and then I was watching, I'm like, oh, right. Yeah. And it's like, it's like a memory from high school that I wouldn't say you impressed. Like, once again, he wasn't bad in it. It's not like, oh my God, Sofia Coppola and Godfather Part 3, but it was just, completely went over me. There are parts of that movie when I look back and I'm like, oh, right, they introduced characters multiple times, and that opening is so stilted, and there's and that ending, and I just, but he kind of slipped through. Whereas this, there was, a more fleshed out character. He's quote unquote the boring one of the group, and yet there was a lot going on there. That great reveal when he's in the camp, after everything that's just happened.
Oh yeah,
a lot of understated humor from his figure, or maybe not humor, but his straight manness to a degree, because he's not exactly a straight man, but compared to the absurdity of everything, does allow for a little bit for that to exist. There is a POV character, so that it's not so ridiculous.
My favorite aspect of that is when they're executing the plan to rescue Harley, and then she just comes around the corner.
Yeah.
Like,
really good plan too.
Yeah.
I also, it's one thing that I will say, this is more of a criticism, like, and we touched upon it a bit earlier, like the reason why I think the Guardians of the Galaxy films, at least the first one, is stronger than this, is because you had a POV character, or at least a central character in Peter Quill Star-Lord. You don't really have that in this movie. You sort of have it with Idris Elba's character, but he's not really introduced until like 20-30 minutes in. And then you have to kind of rewind the movie back to like explain why this character works. So it becomes a bit more delayed. You're like, all right, why do I care about this person? And like, why do I care about these people? Whereas Guardians of the Galaxy, from the get-go, and Steele, you sort of said this, like you know who to identify with and why you care. It's one of those things where like, I wouldn't change the Suicide Squad, especially in terms of its structure. I do like that opening sequence a lot, because I mean, I kind of knew that I'm like, there's no way, like, I was like, they're all dying. Like, this is like, that's the thing. Like, they're all like, all these characters are going to die. That's the joke. Like, I got it. And like, I really enjoyed how it was done and the way it played out. I thought that was so, despite the fact that like I knew kind of what was going to happen. I was like, oh, that was surprisingly well done. You because of that, you do lose a good 20 minutes of knowing who your main character is. And not to say that that is a necessarily bad thing. You know, we don't meet Luke Skywalker until like 20 minutes into of A New Hope. There's a lot of films that you don't really meet the main character until late in the movie. But I just think because it's an ensemble piece, you don't have that sort of identifier to sort of lead you through until late in the game.
Yeah, that's a good point. I also really love that they brought Viola Davis back. I thought, like, you know, for the longest time, CCH Pounder was my ideal Amanda Waller. Like, ever since I saw her on The Shield, I'm like, oh, that's Amanda Waller. And then she voiced him in the animated series, and I'm like, oh, that makes perfect sense. So I was kind of disappointed when they didn't, you know, actually cast her in when they made the first Suicide Squad movie. But then, I mean, but at that same time, I had watched some of How to Get Away with Murder. So when I heard it was Viola Davis, I'm like, oh, that's a good choice. And I think she was one of the best things about the first movie. And she really leaned into the role in this one. Like, you really get a sense for how just like ruthless Amanda Waller is in this movie. And I thought she did an amazing job as that.
Yeah, I can't disagree. You know,
yeah.
no criticism there. You know, very dark figure. You need that figure to embody the twist that happens, and you need that figure to allow for these other ridiculous supervillains. She's the real villain. You know, what's from Megamind? You know, another movie about a villain that works. You know, it's for me. You know, what's the difference between a villain and a supervillain? Supervillains have style. You know, there's this eccentricity to it, and there's no eccentricity to Waller. You know, she is a cold-hearted killer that will do whatever it takes to achieve her ends, and that's who she is. That's the character taken right off the page, taken right off of other adaptations.
Yeah. Okay. Any other things you guys wanted to mention about this movie before we close up?
I'm really excited for the next film in the trilogy, Suicide Squad.
A Suicide Squad. Son of Suicide Squad.
So I tweeted that like right after the movie came out, like the title came out, and I was like really excited for the trilogy, Suicide Squad, whatever year, the Suicide Squad 2021, us Suicide Squad like 2025, and James Gunn liked it, so I'm like, all right, I can retire. Then I didn't, and I kept on tweeting. Like, so no, I think I'm my biggest thing, and I've mentioned before, like I'm surprisingly excited about the future of the DCEU. I'm looking forward to seeing where it goes. I don't know if it's necessarily going to work, but I kind of like if we get more things like this where they let directors play in their sandbox and sort of give their sort of like their feel of it. I'm really because the thing is, like, I don't know where it's gonna go. Like they've already shown Darkseid, sort of. Like, where do they go from here? I don't fucking know. And I kind of like that. I like being surprised. I like not knowing what's gonna happen next.
I'm interested to see how this film survives in the landscape. You know, it had an okay opening, and then it really quickly died in terms of box office, but there is still this kind of percolation and buzz of people like talking about it, liking about it, sharing memes, like doing this thing, and I hope it can survive. You know, I feel that this is a perfectly decent film, a very fun film. You know, I think that, like, is it so strong that I can't wait for another Suicide Squad movie? Like, I don't think so. I don't see where this could go necessarily, but you know, I felt. You know, I felt that way before, and people have surprised me, you know, with you know the ways things can turn out. So maybe, you know, but I do want to see how this builds in a trajectory. Will it become this cult hit? You know, beloved by critics, maybe not beloved, but you know, depending upon whether you look at Rotten Tomatoes, where it's 93% fresh, or Metacritic, which is 72, which is good but not amazing. You know, where where is it really going to fall into all of these things? Like, as much as I love Shazam, it's kind of, lost a little bit of that kind of gleam to it, like when people first saw it. Whereas surprisingly, Aquaman is still around, which
Yeah.
which I thought was going to be kind of a little more like Captain Marvel. We'll see what happens with Captain Marvel 2. But that first one, it did $1 billion at the box office, and then like 6 months later, people had kind of stopped talking about it and kind of forgotten about it. I expected that to be Aquaman, and yet people are still talking about that film.
I wonder how much of that is just to deal with how much other stuff was happening, because you had Captain Marvel, and then right after that you had Endgame. Whereas Aquaman, there was like nothing else around it.
That's perfect. That's a fair observation. Yeah.
And I think also something like, again, somebody who like, I love Shazam, again, for reasons that almost have nothing to do with the movie. But I think like it doesn't have the idiosyncrasy. Help me out here, Steele. Someone call
idiosyncrasies.
Thank you. Idiosyncrasies of like Aquaman or even the Suicide Squad have, like where you look at those films, like the James Wan film, the James Gunn film, like there's some weird shit in those movies that you're like, that only could have happened in an Aquaman film. That only could have happened. And I think the sort of like the memification of movies, for better or for worse, is what helps these things last. Like, to the Blade Runner of it all, the reason why Blade Runner is such a cult thing, it's like it didn't do well at the box office, but it was unique. It's a unique movie. It's not, there's nothing else like it. There really is no other film like the Suicide Squad. And it's weird saying that because it's a sequel to Suicide Squad. There's no really other film like Aquaman. Whereas Shazam, which again, I love it. Not that different from other films of that sort of genre of kid had magic power, do fight bad. It's again, it's the, we'll see.
Yeah, that's what I hope the wrong lesson isn't taken from this. And knowing that it's Warner Brothers and knowing that it's Hollywood, unfortunately, that's more likely than not. But like, what I don't want to see happen is like, well, because this movie is probably going to top out at around $250 million in the box office, thereabouts, give or take 50. Who knows, whether it's going to, whether the play it gets on HBO Max is really going to make up for that or not. But, I guarantee you there are suits who are looking at this and are like, well, Suicide Squad made $750 million, and The Suicide Squad is going to make less than half of that, probably a third of that. So we need to make more movies like Suicide Squad and fewer films like The Suicide Squad. And it happens all the time, and that's why I'm like, I hope that, the buzz continues. Once again, this isn't I, Tonya. This isn't one of these films that I really, really enjoy, as a piece of cinema, and then also, as a fun film. But it's a really good film, and I want Warner Brothers to make more movies like this. And take a stab. Is it a home run? No, but it's a solid double. A very solid, fun film that I think anybody would be pleased if either any of us would make a movie like this. I think we would all be pleased with the effort that came out of it.
Absolutely.
I mean, if you made it, it'd be a miracle.
It's not the kind of movie that I would make, but yes,
no, it's not. Definitely not.
I agree with all that, and Warner Brothers always seems to take the wrong lessons from movies. Like they saw how the dark, grounded approach worked with Batman, and they said, "Oh, this works with all superheroes. Let's try it with Superman," and it didn't. And so we'll kind of see how that plays out. Hopefully, they've learned some lessons, but historically, I'm not sure if that's really a possibility. So we'll see what happens. But for I'm glad we got it. Anyway, I mean, no matter what happens, at least we got this, and we got to see James Gunn just, let his freak flag fly a little bit with this movie. And
speaking of which, to that point, I've never seen anyone get canceled be so successful. Like, we get the best of both worlds. We get the Suicide Squad, and we're getting the Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 and the Guardians of the Galaxy Holiday Special, all because he got canceled. I don't know anyone else who's had that sort of success for some stupid internet cancellation.
Well, we can talk about that. I don't think it's necessarily stupid. Some of the things are pretty tasteless, but at the same time,
but at least he admits it.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, look, that's it. That's his idiom. It's like someone trying to cancel Trey Stone or Matt Barker. I'm like, they own that. I mean, you can
Yeah.
try, but okay.
Yeah. I mean, plus it was when he was doing stuff for Troma, and that was kind of their brand. So
Yeah.
I mean, I think the context is important, especially because that was mostly just people who hated his politics, that they were just trying to find anything.
Yeah.
But yeah. Anyway, so guys, you want to promote your stuff before you close up?
Sure. As we've mentioned, we have Queens of Sapphire Sea coming out right now. You can listen to the first season on queens.buzzsprout.com.
Yes.
It's also on any of your favorite podcast aggregators. Season 2 begins this September, and shortly after that, the full season of The Green Llama premieres in November. You can also check out my novels on Amazon or wherever you buy your favorite books. I have a Green Llama series, and there's other stuff I really want to talk about. Really can't talk about it right now, but and if you happen to be on Vanity Fair and you happen to like a video, there's a good chance I produced it, and I hope you enjoy it. And follow me on at Lance Garcia on Twitter and Instagram. Basically, just type in Lance Garcia. I'll probably be the first thing that comes up, and I am so sorry.
At Words of Steele, that's WORDSOFSTEELE. You can find my podcast, Building a Better Story World, if you're interested in story world construction. It's babsw.buzzsprout.com. You can also go to my website, steelefilipek.com. And my horror comic book, Arcane, is coming out in August, September, October. It's going to take a little break, but it's going to be an ongoing series. You can find that through cosmiclionproductions.com when it goes on sale. I'll also have the Gumroad link and the Comixology link on my website once those go live. But you can also order it for print if you'd like. Would love to hear your thoughts on story world building. If anybody is interested in taking part, I always accept fan submissions for building a better story world. If you want some advice, if you just want to chat story world stuff, or pretty much any of this pop culture stuff, I'm always up for that kind of thing.
Awesome.
Yeah, I should also say that our podcast is called. Sorry.
No, it's okay. Go right ahead.
I'll give you a clean break for edit. Also, our podcast is under the company name Radio Room. You can follow us at Real Radio Room on Twitter. I believe it's also, we have the RadioRoom.com is our website.
RadioRoomShow.com. Yes.
RadioRoomShow.com. Our website is RadioRoomShow.com. And if you search in your favorite podcast aggregator, Radio Room, you should be able to find us.
Okay, guys, thanks so much for stopping by. This was a lot of fun. Adam, great to have you back on the show. Steele,
always a pleasure.
Nice to meet you. Great having you on as well. Thanks so much. Thank you. Okay, that does it for this episode. As always, you can find us at superherocinephiles.com, Super Cinema Pod on both Twitter and Instagram. And also, I have a new podcast that's just launched. It's called E for Evolution, Examining Grant Morrison's X-Men, where me and my two co-hosts, we go through each issue of Grant Morrison's X-Men run, now that it's the 20th anniversary. So you can find that at eforevolution.transistor.fm or anywhere you get your podcasts. Thanks again for watching. Thanks again for listening, and we will see you next time. Thanks for watching. Visit us on the web at superherocinephiles.com, and remember to subscribe to watch more of our videos.
Thank you for listening, and as always, good night, good evening, God bless.